Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. I used to believe a marriage could withstand anything distance, stress, even a few angry words lost in the heat of argument. But nothing prepared me for the quiet erosion of trust, the slow seep of lies that finally cracked my world apart. It began with an innocuous ping on my phone just after lunch, $3,000 withdrawal from joint account. I was sitting at my desk in the open plan office, earbuds in, half listening to a conference call about next quarter's projections. My phone buzzed and I glanced down. Joint account? We never move money without talking first. I texted her. Did you make a withdrawal? She replied almost immediately. Yes, needed some cash for the car repairs. All good. Car repairs. We hadn't discussed fixing the car. Not once. I let it slide. Too tired to press her, too busy convincing myself I was overthinking. But that spark of doubt settled into my chest. It was the kind of doubt you ignore until one day you can't anymore. Over the next week, I watched her more closely. Not in a jealous way, but in a worried way, like you might watch a friend who's begun to stumble. She came home later than usual, claiming overtime. Her phone never left her hand, and she refused to lower it in my presence. Texts that made her laugh in the living room, she deleted as soon as I came in. Late one night, I found myself scrolling through our bank statements again. There it was, another $3,000 withdrawal, then $2,000, then $1,200. Each time, the explanation was vague. House stuff, medical bills, tax stuff. But no bills came in the mail, no shop names were mentioned, no doctors. I started checking our shared calendar. Nothing marked. No appointments, no reminders to pay a mechanic. It was as though the money had vanished into thin air. I confronted her gently at first, wanting to believe there was some reasonable explanation. She gave me that same tired smile and promised she'd explain later. But later never came. One evening, I stayed up for her. I waited on the couch, nursing a glass of whiskey I didn't need. When she finally crept in at 1:17 a.m., she smelled of perfume I didn't recognize. Floral, strong, almost medicinal. Her eyes were glassy. She fumbled her keys, whispered sorry as she locked the door behind her. I asked where she'd been. She shot me a look I'd only seen once before, right after our first real fight, when she wondered aloud if we'd made a mistake getting married. Girls' night, she said. You know the girls at work. I didn't. I'd never heard their names. I asked who they were. She closed her eyes, shook her head. It's nothing. I just needed to talk. That word, talk, felt like an affront. I didn't need to know her conversations. I needed honesty. I needed her voice telling me everything was fine. Instead, I got this hush, this velvet curtain drawn between us.
So I started digging. I logged into her email on her browser. She was always logged in on my old laptop, just to see if she had any receipts. Hidden folders appeared. Vacations, personal, backup. In those folders, I found PDFs of unopened mechanic invoices, debt consolidation letters, and account statements from a bank I'd never heard of, one in a neighboring state. My heart pounded. I printed everything that night. I sat at the kitchen table with a stack of paper and went through it line by line. Every number was a needle in my arm. Every new discovery another hit of betrayal. By the time she woke up, I had questions written on a Post-it and plastered to the fridge. Who is this bank account for? Why did you lie about money? When did you start hiding things from me? She paced the kitchen, hands over her face like she was in pain. For a moment, I thought she might break, but when she spoke, her voice was calm, rehearsed. I'm sorry, I didn't want to burden you. Burden me? This was our life, our home, our dreams. What could be more burdensome than silence? That night, I slept on the couch, but I didn't close my eyes. I stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks I'd never noticed before, each one a line of fracture in my trust. In the morning, she was gone. No note, no goodbye, just an empty side of the bed. I called her phone, straight to voicemail. I opened the front door and looked down the street, half expecting her to be walking back from a neighbor's, brushing off a misunderstanding, but she wasn't there. I moved out 2 days later. I grabbed a few boxes of clothes, my laptop, the wedding photo where we still looked in love. I told my brother I was crashing on his couch until I figured things out. His apartment was smaller than our bedroom, but he made space for me without questions. That night, I sat on his floor, surrounded by cardboard, and let myself collapse. Weeks bled into each other. I stopped eating regular meals, my appetite vanished, replaced by an empty ache in my stomach. I skipped mornings at the gym, I called in sick at work, emails piled unanswered. My boss left me a voicemail. "Mike, you're needed. Call me." I didn't. I replayed everything in my mind. Our first date at that smoky jazz club, the way she used to dance with her eyes closed, the morning she surprised me with breakfast in bed, the way she whispered, "I love you," in the dark. Were those memories lies too? One morning, 2 months after she left, something snapped. I realized I was disappearing into grief, into shame, into an isolation I almost welcomed. I called a therapist whose number a friend had given me. The voice on the other end was gentle. "I have an opening Thursday at 3. Thursday felt like a lifetime away, but I said yes. Therapy wasn't magic, there were no sudden breakthroughs, but there were small moments. A quiet admission that I'd replay every conversation looking for clues, a confession that I felt worthless because she had manipulated me so thoroughly, a fear that I'd never trust myself again.
My therapist gave me homework. Write a letter to her. Not to send, just to pour out everything. I wrote pages in a single sitting. Anger, confusion, sorrow, a longing so deep it felt like gravity pulling me under. I tore it up when I finished, but kept the scraps in a drawer, a reminder that I'd said it all. I forced myself outside. I walked the neighborhood, past the little coffee shop where we used to linger on Saturdays, past the park bench where I first said, "I love you." At first, it felt like torture. Then it felt like reclaiming the world I'd handed her. As the months passed, I started to rebuild. I rented a one-bedroom apartment with walls I could paint, no more beige office tones. I switched jobs, taking one that paid a little less but let me leave by 5. I joined a writing group, something I'd always wanted to try but never did out of fear of failure. I wrote about him, D, and her, and me, and how we'd all ended up strangers in the same story. I wrote about mornings that didn't hurt so much, and the first night I slept through without waking. A year after she disappeared, I launched a podcast called Men Who Were Lied To. I shared my story in the first episode, my voice shaking as I played back the bank notifications, the text messages, my own admissions of weakness. Listeners wrote in, hundreds of men telling me their stories of betrayal, emotional abuse, financial ruin. Together, we formed a community. Awkwardly at first, then more confidently. We swapped tips on picking trustworthy accountants, on asking the right questions before marriage, on recognizing gaslighting. We talked about setting boundaries and rebuilding self-worth. I still flinch when I hear those words, "I promise," but I'm learning to hear them differently now, to test them, to give them space to prove themselves, instead of letting them crack me open. Last week, I moved into a new place with a view of the city skyline. I filled the walls with art I love, abstract paintings with bold strokes, a photograph of the night sky she once said reminded her of freedom. I smile at that photo now, because freedom is mine, even if it came at a price. I keep that wedding portrait too, but it's no longer a prison. It's part of my history, a reminder of what can happen when love goes dark, and how the human heart can find its way back to light. I used to think betrayal meant the end. Now I know it can also be the beginning.
One afternoon, 3 months into the podcast, I got an email that stopped me in my tracks. The subject line read simply, "I'm glad you survived." Inside, a man named Tom described stumbling upon my first episode while driving home from an empty house he'd just rented out, an inherited home he'd sold off room by room to pay for his divorce lawyer's fees. His words were ragged, weighted with exhaustion and relief. "I never thought I'd feel heard again until I listened to you." I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. I didn't know this man, but I recognized that same gnawing ache in his confession. The ache of feeling deceived by the person you trusted most. That night, I recorded a bonus episode just for him, speaking directly into my microphone. Tom, you're not alone. This wound doesn't define you. I shared a story I'd never told before, how 6 months earlier I'd driven past our old house and almost stopped the car, wanting to knock on the door and beg her to explain. Instead, I kept driving until I didn't recognize the road. After that episode aired, messages poured in. Men and women, though mostly men, though I'd never invited women, for whom betrayal felt like a crime scene they couldn't leave. Some wrote from halfway around the world, Australia, Brazil, India. Our shared pain was a thread connecting us, a confession that hit broadcast waves and landed in empty kitchens, lonely cars, and midnight bedrooms. A month later, I met Tom for coffee at a downtown cafe. He was a tall guy with wide shoulders and haunted eyes. We sat at a small table by the window as the barista called out our names. He told me about his marriage of 14 years, the moment he discovered his ex had been funneling money into offshore accounts, the months he spent living in their empty home like a ghost. He paused, too ashamed to finish his sentence. So I told him about the day I tore apart our kitchen table with printouts of hidden bank statements, the way my hands shook so badly I could barely hold the scissors. I told him about my first therapy session, how my therapist taught me to say out loud when I felt myself slipping, "I'm drowning." Tom looked at me and nodded. "That was me too," he said. "Drowning." By the time we parted, the afternoon sun had dipped low, turning the cafe windows molten gold. We shook hands, two men bound by unspeakable wounds, each stepping back into our separate lives with a small piece of each other's burden lifted. Back at my apartment, I opened the drawer where I'd kept the paper scraps of that unsent letter. For the first time, I spread them out on my desk, reading lines I'd written in fury and sorrow. I picked up a matchbook from a diner in my old neighborhood, where she and I had once danced under a jukebox's neon glow, and lit one edge of the paper. As the flame crept along the crumpled edges, I realized I no longer felt vengeance. I felt release. Over the next few weeks, I expanded the podcast into short video essays. I filmed myself walking through that old neighborhood, pointing out the jazz club where we'd first connected, the park bench where we'd carved our initials into the wood. I spoke into the camera like I was speaking to my past self. I'm here now. I survived.
Then I did something I never expected. I asked my listeners to send in voice messages telling me how they'd rebuilt their lives. The response was immediate and overwhelming. A man named Raj from Toronto described training for a half marathon to reclaim his body. A listener in Mexico City explained how he'd learned Spanish poetry to articulate the emotions he'd buried. A retired firefighter in Glasgow spoke of rescuing stray dogs to fill the emptiness his ex-wife had left behind. Each story was a brick in a new foundation, one built on resilience instead of deception. I wove their voices into a special episode titled The Reconstruction, layering their triumphs over my own reflections. When it dropped, the download numbers spiked. But more important than the metrics was the sense of shared purpose, every disconnected life thread finding its way back into a tapestry of survival. My therapist remarked on this shift in our monthly session. "You're moving from processing grief to curating hope," she said, scribbling notes. I realized she was right. I wasn't just unpacking pain anymore. I was gathering the scattered pieces of all our stories and crafting something new, a map for anyone lost at sea after heartbreak. One evening, I received an invitation to speak at a men's mental health conference. The organizers wanted me to talk about honesty, betrayal, and the path forward. Standing on that stage under bright lights and before a room full of restless faces, I felt a surge of purpose stronger than any wound.
I told them about the pings on my phone that once felt like landmines, about the late-night searches through hidden folders, about the letter I wrote and burned. And then I told them about the emails from strangers, the coffee with Tom, the matchlit papers, the voices woven into my podcast. By the time I finished, the audience was on its feet. Some were crying, others were hugging. I looked out at that crowd and saw people I'd never met, yet I knew exactly what they carried in their chests. I knew how betrayal felt, and I knew how healing could begin. I came home that night and didn't turn on the TV. I sat at my desk, opened a blank document, and began to type the first chapter of a book. It wasn't the memoir I once imagined, a straightforward timeline of my marriage and its unraveling. It was a guidebook, part personal story, part toolkit for anyone who needed to find their way back from betrayal. I wrote about how to spot small lies before they become avalanches. I wrote about questions to ask yourself when you feel doubt creeping in. I wrote about rituals that could help you reclaim your life. A morning walk, a letter you never send, a podcast episode you record just for one listener you'll never meet. 2 years have passed since I first saw that bank notification. The man I was then, the man who flinched at every unexpected text, who slept with one eye open, who thought love meant sealing yourself into a prison of secrets. He's gone. In his place stands someone still cautious, still aware of how fragile trust can be. But he's also someone who believes in fresh starts, in communal healing, in the alchemy of turning betrayal into a catalyst for transformation. Some nights I still dream of her face, lit by the glow of a hidden phone, her eyes restless with lies. I wake up, heart pounding, and remind myself of the sunrise, of new light, of open curtains, of walls painted in colors I chose. I tell myself, you survived, and I smile, 'cause it's true. I spent the next year drafting chapters, each one a dive deeper into the wreckage I'd woken up in and the roads I'd taken to rebuild. Some nights I sat at my desk until 2 in the morning, rewriting the same passage over and over until it felt like honest blood. I wrote about the moment I first logged back into my bank account without flinching, the way I taught myself to ask direct questions when something didn't add up, the ritual of 3 deep breaths before replying to a text that triggered old fears. Every detail felt necessary, a brick in the bridge I was building from my past into whatever future lay ahead. When the manuscript finally went to my editor, I felt both relief and panic. I imagined readers opening it and recoiling, or worse, closing it halfway because the wounds were too raw. But the early feedback was immediate. Men in their 20s, 30s, 40s writing to tell me that just putting words to these experiences had given them permission to speak their own truths. My editor suggested adding sidebars, questions a reader could answer in a journal, prompts for conversations with counselors or friends. I agreed. I wanted this book to be a living thing, one that reached out and held a hand. The book launched 6 months later under the title Betrayal's Echo. I still remember the first Amazon notification ping, #12 in personal finance and relationships. I stared at my phone in disbelief, then grinned until my cheeks hurt, not because I cared about rankings, but because it meant someone else, maybe a man sitting alone in an airport lounge, would open these pages and realize he wasn't breaking apart in private anymore. I did a handful of readings in bookstores around the city. Each event felt like stepping onto a stage without a script. I'd read a passage, then open the floor to questions. Hands shot up from men whose voices trembled as they asked things like, "How did you know when to stop blaming yourself?" Or, "What if my partner refuses to answer my questions?" I answered honestly, that blame had a half-life and dissipated only when I faced the facts, and that sometimes you have to stop waiting for answers and start building your own life, regardless of whether they ever come. Between readings, I carved out time for the small pleasures I'd abandoned: Sunday morning runs along the river, jazz concerts in dimly lit clubs, cooking elaborate dinners for my brother and his family. I found myself laughing easily again, the lines around my eyes softening. I met Claire at one of my book events. She waited until the crowd thinned to approach me. She'd been through her own nightmare of deception, and when she told me her story, I realized I'd never quite listened so intently in my life. We traded emails, then coffee dates, then hikes where we talked until our voices grew hoarse.
There was no rush, just two people finding their way back to trust. By the time our first anniversary rolled around, I recognized how far I'd come. I'd nearly forgotten the shape of my old apartment, the stale air that reminded me of emptiness. Now my place smelled of fresh paint, coffee brewing, and the faint trail of lavender Claire wore. We picked out a small wooden table to replace the one shredded by my printouts. Each scratch on its surface felt like a testament to endurance rather than destruction. Even so, memories of her, my ex, still visited me, slipping into dreams where she stood at the door apologizing or laughing at some forgotten joke. When I woke in a cold sweat, I'd reach over and see Claire's steady breathing beside me and know I was home. The past was still there, but it no longer dictated my waking hours. At 38,000 words into the book, I wrote a final chapter called Beyond the Echo, imagining what betrayal could teach us rather than only what it could take away. I proposed small rituals, lighting a candle in honor of the self you lost, planting a tree to mark your new beginning, writing a letter of forgiveness you might never send, whether to them or yourself. These rituals, I argued, could help a wounded heart shift from collapse to creation. Today, I hold the finished copy of Betrayal's Echo in my hands as I sit by the window. The city lights flicker in the distance, and a late breeze stirs the curtains. I flip through the pages, see how far the words have traveled, from my isolation on my brother's couch to these printed sheets that might rest on someone else's nightstand. I feel the tremors of that old pain, but no longer an earthquake. Instead, it's a pulse, a reminder that beneath every fracture, life still beats, ready for the next step forward. Thank you for listening to my story here on Reddit Whispers. Now I want to hear from you. What's the most unexpected, life-changing decision you've ever made when everything seemed to fall apart? Share your thoughts in a comment section, because you never know, yours might be the one that someone else needs to hear today.